November 5th, 1941. Nagatacho, Tokyo. Inside the Imperial Palace complex, the air tastes of lacquer, ink, and coal smoke drifting in from the city. Rain taps at the roof tiles with a patient rhythm, as if the weather itself is counting time. In a guarded chamber lit by shaded lamps, men in dark uniforms and formal court dress sit rigidly, their hands folded over folders that carry the weight of an empire. Prime Minister and War Minister Hideki Tojo keeps his jaw clenched. His round spectacles catch the light when he lowers his gaze to the papers. Across the table, Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada sits with the stillness of a ship at anchor, but his fingers tighten on the edge of a briefing book. Chief of the Naval General Staff Admiral Osami Nagano listens with eyes half-lidded, his expression unreadable, as if he is hearing waves break far away. The documents on the table do not shout, they do not argue, they simply exist. Columns of figures, steel output, shipbuilding tonnage, aircraft engine production, oil reserves measured in months, not years, merchant hulls and tankers, the lifelines of any island nation, listed like bones. A staff officer slides a chart forward. It is the kind of chart that can end a war before it begins, if anyone has the courage to let it. Someone clears his throat. The room does not relax. The Navy representatives speak first, because this is a war the Navy insists it must win quickly, decisively, and with shock. They talk about the southern resource area as if it is a warehouse that can be seized in a single night. Oil fields in the Indies, rubber in Malaya, tin, bauxite. The words feel solid on the tongue. The reality is a sea filled with American submarines and a horizon filled with American shipyards. Tojo listens, then asks, not loudly, for the practical calculation. How long can the empire fight if the United States enters fully? A silence falls that is not empty. It is full of men looking at the same numbers and choosing which ones to say out loud. The answer comes in careful language. The empire can fight for a time. It can strike hard. It can seize territory, but it cannot outbuild. It cannot replace ships at the pace America can launch them. It cannot train pilots as fast as America can produce aircraft. It cannot keep merchant shipping alive if the sea lanes are hunted. In another room, in another building, planners already know the American industrial map by heart. They know the names of places they will never bomb into silence. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, San Diego, New York. A continent that can lose a fleet and lay down another while the ink is still drying on the casualty lists. That knowledge is in this room too, even if it is spoken as if it might offend the walls. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is not present at the Imperial Conference table, but his shadow is. He's out with the combined fleet, and his name is carried into meetings like a warning label. Officers repeat what he has said in private conversations, the tone always the same, half blunt honesty, half resignation. If war comes, Japan can run wild for a short span. After that, the outcome is uncertain, and uncertainty is a polite word for doom. You can picture him aboard a battleship or in a stab office at Kure, cigarette smoke curling up under a lamp, staring at a map that is too wide for the Empire's hands. Not defeated, not yet, but already measuring the distance between what Japan can do and what it must do. Tojo presses for certainty because his position demands it. He asks about decisive battle. He asks about the attack plan that will cripple American will. He asks about the single blow that will buy freedom of action. The Navy men respond with the tools they have: carriers, trained air groups, torpedoes modified for shallow water, rehearsed strikes. They describe aircraft with folded wings and red roundels, the smell of aviation fuel, the crisp snap of signal flags, the mechanics in oil-stained uniforms working by lantern light. They talk about speed and surprise because speed and surprise are cheaper than steel. But then the conversation returns to the numbers, like a needle returning to a groove. The Americans have oil, the Americans have aluminum, the Americans have rail lines and rivers and factories that can be shifted to war production like muscles tensing. Japan has skill, discipline, and a limited supply chain stretched across open ocean. If Japan loses pilots, replacing them takes time it does not have. If Japan loses carriers, replacing them takes steel it cannot spare. If Japan loses merchant ships, it loses the ability to feed its armies and fuel its fleet. A senior officer says it plainly, not with drama, but with the tired voice of someone who has tried every calculation and gotten the same answer. Even if initial operations succeed, America will replace its losses fast. Success might not produce lasting strategic effect. That phrase lands like a cold coin in the palm. Tojo's face does not change, but his eyes flick to the chart again. You can almost hear what he does not say. If that is true, then what is the purpose of the blow? Outside, the rain continues. Guards stand with rifles held close under their capes. Tokyo traffic hums beyond the palace grounds, unaware of how narrow the path has become. Inside the chamber, the leaders of Japan feel the future closing in, not as prophecy but as arithmetic. They do not call it impossible. Not yet. They call it a gamble. They call it a necessity. They call it the only path left. And somewhere beyond the walls, across the Pacific, the American war economy is not even fully awake. December 7th, 1941. Dawn over Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. The sea is a hard slate color, and the cold bites through gloves as deck crews move with practiced urgency. On the carrier Akagi, sailors keep their voices low. Boots thud on steel. A signal lamp blinks. The smell of exhaust and salt hangs in the air like a promise. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto does not stand on this deck, but the operation is his signature, written across the Pacific. The strike force commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, watches the final preparations with a face as tight as the knots in the rigging. He is a man given a knife and told to carve open an enemy before the enemy can wake. In Tokyo, the men who stared at those charts now wait for the message that the gamble has begun. Not all of them believe in it the same way. Some believe in spirit, in shock, in the idea that pain will force negotiation. Others believe because the alternatives have already been burned away. Oil embargoes, steel shortages, a navy that will slowly rust in harbor if it cannot sail. The first wave lifts off into a sky that is turning pale. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, their engines roaring as they climb and form up. You can imagine the pilots, young and confident, glancing at the horizon, thinking of the medals they will win, thinking of the emperor, thinking of the clean geometry of a plan that promises to change history in a single morning. Hours later, the radio speaks, and the words feel unreal even to the men who demanded this moment. Tora, Tora, Tora. Pearl Harbor burns. Battleships list in oily water. Smoke smears the blue Hawaiian sky. The attack is a triumph of training and surprise, and for a brief instant it seems to answer every fear raised in that rain-soaked Tokyo chamber. The United States has been struck. The Pacific Fleet has been wounded. The world is forced to look. But inside the Navy, even on the day of victory, the quiet sentence beneath the triumph remains. Was it decisive? Nagumo's staff officers argue over the second strike. Some want to hunt the fuel tanks, the repair shops, the dry docks, the infrastructure that turns ships into power. Others fear American carriers are out there somewhere. And fear has its own arithmetic. Lose carriers now, and the gamble ends immediately. They withdraw, and the sea swallows the strike force like a closing mouth. In Tokyo, celebration is carefully framed. Flags, speeches, newspapers calling the attack glorious. Yet in secure rooms, The men return to the same charts they tried not to look at. A fleet is not only ships sunk, it is dockyards, oil, trained crews, the ability to rebuild. Pearl Harbor is a wound, but it is not a death. Tojo sits with advisors and listens to reports. The words come in crisp, military language, but beneath the confidence he hears what he has always heard. The Americans will replace what they lost. A month passes, 2 months. The empire surges across the map. Hong Kong falls, Malaya collapses, Singapore, the fortress, is taken. The Philippines are strangled. The Dutch East Indies are seized for oil. On maps, it looks like an answer to every shortage. On docks, it looks like endless barrels that must be shipped home across waters that get wider the farther you go. Then the first cracks appear, small enough that a politician can dismiss them and big enough that a logistician cannot sleep. Trained pilots are not barrels of oil. They are years of flight time. They are instructors. They are spare parts. They are aircraft engines that wear out. Every combat sortie consumes something irreplaceable. Shipping is not a background detail. It is blood in the veins. Every convoy sunk is a unit starving somewhere. A carrier group waiting for fuel. A factory at home slowing because raw materials are late. American submarines begin to hunt, not in a single dramatic day, but in a steady, accumulating rhythm. A transport disappears, then another, then tankers. The numbers shift quietly, and every Japanese planner knows how to read the shift. Spring 1942, Tokyo, a conference room in the Navy Ministry. Officers spread reports on the table. Their faces are drawn now, less ceremonial, more practical. Someone points to an American production estimate, and the room goes still for a moment. The United States is not only repairing, it is expanding. Keels laid, ships launched, factories converting, training pipelines filling. The American war economy, once a rumor on Japanese charts, is now a living thing, breathing out steel and aircraft. A senior naval officer speaks with a controlled voice, choosing words like a surgeon choosing where to cut. Even if Japan wins battles, he says, the enemy can replace losses faster than Japan can create them. A victory that costs too much becomes a defeat that simply takes longer. It is not defeatism, it is calculation. Someone else mentions the carriers that were not at Pearl Harbor, the American carriers that escaped. Those ships are not just targets. They are symbols of what the strike failed to finish. The empire has gained time, but time is exactly what it cannot afford to spend. In the weeks that follow, Yamamoto pushes for a plan to force the decisive battle. He wants to draw the American carriers out, smash them, and buy a year, maybe 2. He speaks in the language of the fleet, but the foundation is still those same numbers. Japan must end the war before American production fully arrives, because once it arrives, the war becomes a math problem Japan cannot solve. You can feel the pressure building, like a rising engine pitch before takeoff. The empire races forward because standing still is death. In meeting rooms, leaders begin to speak less about whether America can be beaten and more about how long Japan can hold the field before the weight of American power settles onto the ocean. And in that shift, the realization begins to form into words that will haunt them later. That even the perfect surprise could not change the balance of factories and fuel. June 4th, 1942, North Pacific, near Midway Atoll. The morning sky is clear enough to feel cruel. Sunlight glitters on the ocean in a way that makes distances hard to judge, and on the flight decks of 4 Japanese carriers, the air trembles with heat, gasoline fumes, and tension. On Akagi, red-armed deck crews move like ants across a giant blade. Bombs are rolled into place. Torpedoes are shifted. Aircraft are refueled. Every minute is measured in hand signals and shouted orders that vanish into engine noise. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands under the island structure. his eyes fixed on the horizon and on the clock, feeling the operation slip between his fingers. In the hangars below, machines are packed tight, and the smell is sharp, like metal and sweat and fuel-soaked canvas. Then the reports arrive in fragments. A sighting, uncertainty. Another message. American carriers are out there. The decisive battle Yamamoto wanted is beginning. But it is beginning wrong. Above the fleet, Japanese fighters are tangled in the sky with American planes that come in waves, low and desperate. Torpedo bombers skim the water and die. The Japanese gunners cheer, briefly, because the sky seems full of falling enemies. The decks look safe for a moment, as if discipline and training will carry the day. Then the dive bombers arrive, high, quiet, almost invisible until they tip over. From the bridge, Nagumo sees specks that grow fast. He hears the rising scream of diving engines cutting through everything. You can almost feel the second before impact, that thin moment when a man understands he cannot move a ship or a fate quickly enough. Bombs strike. Steel shudders. Fire erupts as if the ships themselves have been split open to reveal their burning insides. Aviation fuel ignites. Armed aircraft cook off. Explosions run through hangar decks in sickening pulses. The carriers that were supposed to secure the Empire's future become furnaces. By afternoon, Japan has lost what it cannot easily replace. Not just hulls, but the trained air groups, the experienced deck crews, the intricate web of skill that took years to build. Men leap into the sea to escape flame, their faces blackened, their lungs full of smoke. The water is cold, but it is kinder than the decks, far away. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto receives the reports and holds his expression steady. He has always known the gamble had a cliff edge. Now he hears the crash of it. Midway is not merely a defeat. It is the kind of loss that turns a nation's timetable into a trap. In Tokyo, the news is filtered at first, softened, delayed. But inside the Navy Ministry, in the Imperial General Headquarters, the truth spreads through secure channels with the speed of panic. Senior officers gather around maps, their fingers tracing routes that now look like threats rather than plans. Someone mutters that the Americans will build more carriers. Someone else replies, quietly, that the Americans are already building more. The phrase is not said for dramatic effect. It is said because it is true. A staff officer lays down production estimates, new Essex-class carriers, more destroyers, Liberty ships by the hundreds, aircraft output that climbs and climbs, training programs that feed pilots into squadrons like a river that never dries. A Japanese officer, tired enough to sound older than he is, says what everyone in the room is thinking. Even if Japan wins a battle, America can absorb it, replace it, and come back stronger. The Empire has no such cushion. Every loss is permanent in a way that does not show on the day it happens, but shows a month later when units cannot be rebuilt. Summer 1942. A map of the Solomons is spread on a table. The Japanese leadership sees a new line of danger, Guadalcanal, a small airfield on a jungle island, a name that does not sound important until it becomes a choke point for shipping and a stage for attrition. When the Americans land in August, Japanese commanders react with instinct. They will retake the island. They will smash the foothold. They will show that Midway was an accident, not a turning point. Night after night, warships race down the slot. Destroyers and cruisers run supplies and troops. The sailors call it the Tokyo Express. But there is no pride in the name now. It is a necessity. Barges, drums of fuel, rice sacks, ammunition crates, men packed tight, hungry before they even land. And every night, the Americans get better. American radar finds ships in darkness. American pilots learn the routes. American logistics plants itself on Henderson Field and refuses to be uprooted. For Japan, the campaign becomes a grinding machine that eats fuel, shells, aircraft, and men. For the United States, it becomes a crucible that trains commanders and tactics while factories at home continue to roar. In Tokyo, meetings grow sharper. The Army and Navy argue over priorities, but the arguments are boxed in by the same reality. Shipping is bleeding. Fuel is tight. Experienced pilots are thinning. Replacement pilots arrive with fewer hours. Engines fail. Spare parts run out. The empire expands, yet the ability to sustain expansion shrinks. A senior leader, voice low so the walls cannot hear, compares Japan and America as if comparing two fires. Japan burns hot but small, consuming its best material fast. America burns wide, fed by endless fuel and steel. Another officer tries to cling to faith. He says the Americans are soft. Their will can be broken. But the men who handle the numbers do not answer with ideology. They answer with tonnage, with aircraft output, with convoy capacity. By the time Guadalcanal becomes a withdrawal instead of a victory, the understanding is no longer a private fear. It is a shared burden. Japan can still fight fiercely. It can still strike hard, but it cannot match the pace of replacement. It cannot outlast an enemy that turns loss into learning and learning into mass production. And in the quiet after the meetings, when the folders are closed and the lamps are turned down, the leaders are left with the same thought that began the war, now sharpened by smoke and wreckage. The gap is widening, and it will not close. November 20th, 1943. Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The sea is shallow and bright, turning the lagoon into a sheet of glass that betrays every landing craft. American battleships pound the tiny strip of sand until the air tastes like cordite and pulverized coral. Waves roll in, carrying men toward a beach that has been turned into a killing ground. From far away, Japanese officers read the reports and feel the world changing under their feet. Tarawa is small, but what happens there is enormous. The Americans do not merely land, they absorb casualties that would have broken another nation, and they keep coming. They bring bulldozers, radios, replacement units, medical evacuation, and a supply chain that seems to stretch from the beach back to a continent. In Tokyo, senior leaders listen to updates that come in with brutal clarity. American amphibious operations are becoming routine. The enemy is learning faster than Japan can adapt, and every lesson is reinforced by production. Every loss is replaced. Every setback becomes a revision to doctrine, and the next wave arrives larger. In secure rooms, planners line up information like weights on a scale. The United States is launching new ships at a tempo that feels unreal. New carriers that are not precious assets, but expected parts of a growing machine. New destroyers, new submarines, merchant hulls, tankers. The logistics tail that Japan cannot sever no matter how many islands it occupies. Japan's own production charts, by contrast, look like a man trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. Aircraft factories work, but they lack raw materials. Engines are complicated and scarce. Aluminum is tight. Fuel is tighter. Training hours are cut because gasoline must be saved for combat. Pilot quality begins to dip, not because the new men are cowards, but because they are rushed. They arrive at frontline units with fewer landings, fewer gunnery passes, fewer night flights. They are handed powerful aircraft and sent into skies ruled by increasing numbers of enemy fighters. A commander in the Navy, a man who has watched the air war from the beginning, says it with a bitterness he cannot hide. Japan is spending irreplaceable experience for temporary gains. America spends replaceable machines for permanent advantage. February 1st, 1943. Guadalcanal has already slipped away. The evacuation, the so-called victory in withdrawal, leaves behind a truth that everyone knows. Japan could not hold. Japan could not sustain. The enemy's supply pipeline did not crack. It thickened. In the months that follow, another blow lands. quieter than Midway, but just as lethal in its way. American submarines, improving their torpedoes and tactics, cut deeper into Japan's merchant shipping. Each tanker sunk is not just a lost ship, it is a lost month of fleet operations. It is a factory slowing. It is an army unit receiving less rice and fewer bullets. Japanese leaders begin to talk about oil in the same tone a dying man uses to talk about water. In one meeting, an army officer demands more shipping for troop movement. A navy officer replies that the ships do not exist. The ones they had are on the bottom. The ones they build cannot keep pace with the sinkings. The ones they save are not enough to feed both the front and the homeland. The argument turns, as it always does, into logistics. Logistics is the war now. American convoys cross the Pacific with escorts and air cover. New airfields appear on captured islands, built with CBs and machinery that makes Japanese engineers stare in disbelief. The Americans turn coral into runways in days. They stockpile fuel in quantities Japan cannot imagine. They rotate units. They rest crews. They repair ships forward, close to the front, as if they are moving the entire industrial base step by step across the ocean. For Japan, every forward base is a fragile outpost with limited fuel and limited repair capacity. A damaged ship must limp home across thousands of miles. A wounded animal leaving blood in the water for submarines to smell. By late 1943, senior Japanese naval staff officers speak more openly among themselves. They do not use the word hopeless in official minutes, but their private tone changes. The decisive battle they once chased now looks like a fantasy because the enemy has too many ships to trap into a single arena. Even if Japan destroys one carrier group, another will appear. Even if Japan wins a tactical success, it will not last because the American industrial conveyor belt keeps moving. One officer, staring at a paper that lists American ship launches, lets the mask slip for a moment. He says it feels like fighting a nation that can replace blood with steel. The reality is worse. America replaces steel with more steel, and the blood is carried away on hospital ships and aircraft, while Japan's wounded often die on remote islands without medicine. In the same year, the Japanese leadership begins to see another kind of threat. American air power is growing not only in number but in reach. Long-range bombers, carrier air groups that train and rotate, radar, better pilot training, better tactics, better coordination. Japanese aircraft that were once feared are now met by enemy fighters that climb faster, dive harder, and arrive in swarms. Anti-aircraft fire is denser. American damage control becomes legendary, keeping ships alive that Japanese crews would have lost. Each engagement teaches the Americans and costs the Japanese experience they cannot replenish. In Tokyo, the atmosphere in high-level councils becomes strained. The Army argues that holding ground is essential. The Navy argues that the fleet cannot operate without fuel and carriers. The political leaders speak about negotiating. But the terms are elusive. Japan must show strength to negotiate. But showing strength consumes strength. Some leaders begin to confess the central contradiction. The initial attacks did not create lasting strategic effect because America's losses were rapidly replaced. The empire has fought brilliantly, but brilliance does not build ships. Bravery does not pump oil. Victories in distant seas do not matter if the enemy returns with twice the force. The gap in production and logistics is no longer widening slowly. It is accelerating. It is becoming a slope too steep to climb. And still, the war continues. Because ending it requires a decision that no one in Tokyo can yet force through the walls of ideology and fear. June 19th, 1944. Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. The horizon is a perfect circle of blue, and the ocean looks calm enough to be harmless. Above it, the air is crowded with vapor trails, turning the sky into a chalkboard where men write their last minutes. On the carrier Taiho, the newest pride of the fleet, Flight deck crews crouch low as engines howl and aircraft roll forward. Sweat runs down backs despite the sea breeze. The pilots climb into cockpits with faces set in hard confidence, but the confidence is thinner now. Many are young, too young. Their hands know the controls, yet they do not carry the same instinct the veterans had. The instinct built from hundreds of hours in the air that Japan no longer has the fuel to provide. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands with his staff and watches the launch. This is supposed to be the moment Japan reclaims initiative. The plan still leans on the old faith: strike first, strike hard, force the Americans to recoil. But the enemy fleet waiting out there is not the Pearl Harbor fleet. It is a rolling armory. American radar finds the incoming raids early. Fighters climb in disciplined waves, guided by radios and controllers who see the battle before the pilots do. When Japanese planes arrive, they do not find a surprised opponent. They find a wall. One Japanese strike group is cut apart almost as soon as it forms. Fighters slash through formations. Anti-aircraft fire blossoms in timed bursts that feel like a net. Planes fall into the sea in spirals, trailing smoke like torn banners. Those that reach the American carriers drop bombs that miss or hit without decisive effect, because the ships are built to survive and crews are trained to fight the damage like a second enemy. Japanese pilots return to their carriers in trickles, their tanks near empty, their faces drawn. Some cannot find their decks. Some ditch into the ocean. Search planes go out. But the sea is wide, and the war does not pause for rescue. Then the submarines speak. An American submarine finds Taiho and sends torpedoes into its side. Fuel fumes spread through the ship. Minutes later, an explosion tears through internal spaces, and the carrier begins to die from the inside out. On another carrier, Shokaku is struck and sinks, taking with it men and aircraft that Japan cannot replace. By the time the battle ends, the Japanese Navy has lost not only ships, but the thing it has been bleeding since 1942. Pilots, aircrew, the trained corps that made carriers lethal. In Tokyo, when the reports reach the senior councils, the mood is not shock. Shock belongs to nations that expected a different outcome. This is closer to a grim recognition, like hearing a door shut in a hallway and knowing it locked. The Navy briefs the disaster with controlled voices. The numbers are recited like a funeral register. Aircraft lost, aircrew lost, carriers damaged, carriers sunk. The Americans, by contrast, have lost fewer planes, fewer pilots, and can pull replacements from a pipeline that never seems to run dry. A senior naval officer speaks in the language of hard reality. Japan's carrier air power has been crippled, not temporarily, structurally. There is no reservoir of trained men to rebuild it quickly, and there is not enough fuel to create one. Someone mentions that American losses will be replaced within months. Another man answers that Japan cannot replace its own losses within years. That is the moment the comparison becomes unbearable. It is no longer a matter of who is braver or who fights harder. It is the difference between a nation that can rebuild while fighting and a nation that must cannibalize itself just to stay on the field. Weeks later, July 9th, 1944, Saipan falls. On the islands, the fighting is close and brutal, and the end is a horror of cliffs and chaos. In Tokyo, the political impact lands like a shell burst. Saipan is not just a loss of territory. It is a breach in the perimeter that was supposed to keep the homeland safe. The fall triggers a government crisis. Men who have spoken confidently for years now measure their words more carefully. They look at maps and see American bombers within range. They see airfields that can support sustained operations, not raids but campaigns. Inside the imperial conferences, the language shifts further. There is talk of decisive battle still, but it has a different tone, like a prayer repeated out of habit. There is talk of making the enemy pay. There is talk of inflicting casualties so severe that America will reconsider. Yet the planners who track American manpower, training, and production see what this means. Japan is now speaking about hurting, not winning. Autumn 1944. The Philippines become the next stage. Japan commits what remains of its fleet for a massive confrontation. Because losing the Philippines means losing the sea routes from the southern resource area. Without those routes, the homeland starves for oil and the military suffocates. October 23rd, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf begins as a storm of separate battles. Japanese ships move under threat of air attack, hiding in rain squalls, trying to slip through gaps. They are brave, and they are hunted. American carrier planes strike again and again, wave after wave, as if the sky itself is an assembly line. Japanese battleships and cruisers take hits and keep moving until they cannot. Escorts vanish. Communications break. The Japanese fleet fragments under pressure that never relents. And then, in the shadow of all this, a new kind of message appears in reports, almost unbelievable in its cold simplicity. Special attack units. Young pilots ordered to crash into ships because bombs and torpedoes are no longer enough. Because trained aviators are too rare. Because the war has become so lopsided that sacrifice is being used as a substitute for industry. In Tokyo, the leaders who once tried to solve America with one decisive strike now confront the final arithmetic. America's power is not a single fleet. It is a system that replaces losses, expands forward, and makes each victory permanent. Japan is still fighting, but the leaders can feel the war slipping into a place where every option is merely a different way to lose. March 9th, 1945. Tokyo. Night falls like a lid, and then the sky opens. The first waves of American B-29 bombers arrive high and steady, engines droning like an approaching storm. Below, the city is a dark sprawl of wood and paper, narrow streets, tightly packed homes, workshops that feed the war effort, families sleeping in rooms that smell of tatami and charcoal. Air raid sirens wail, and the sound cuts through the neighborhoods like a blade. People run to shelters, to canals, to anywhere they think the fire cannot reach. Then the incendiaries fall. Flames catch and spread with horrifying speed. Wind turns the fire into a living thing, pushing it block by block. Heat becomes a wall. Smoke becomes a second night. Streets fill with fleeing civilians and falling embers. The air burns in the lungs. Whole districts glow orange, then white, then collapse into black. In government bunkers and protected offices, Japanese leaders receive reports that are no longer about distant islands. The war has arrived at the capital with a force that no perimeter can stop. When they speak now, they speak in shorter sentences. Not because they have fewer thoughts, but because there is no room left for decoration. The military still talks about fighting to the last. The slogans remain. But the men who have watched the production figures for years know what the slogans cannot change. They cannot stop the American conveyor belt of ships and aircraft. They cannot restore the merchant fleet that has been sunk piece by piece. They cannot conjure oil into tanks that are nearly empty. They cannot train pilots with gasoline they do not have. They cannot replace divisions that have been destroyed, because the transport ships that would move replacements are gone, and the ports are under attack. In April 1945, Okinawa becomes the final proving ground. It is close enough to the homeland to feel like a fist raised at the throat. Japanese defenders fight from caves and ridges, disciplined and desperate, while American artillery and air power pound the island day after day. Offshore, the American fleet anchors in immense numbers, repairing ships, rotating crews, absorbing kamikaze strikes and continuing to operate. It is the same story again, magnified. Japan spends lives and aircraft for moments. America spends machines and replaces them. Inside Tokyo, leaders sit around tables with faces hollowed by sleeplessness. Some have lost family homes in the fires. Some have seen the nation's rail line strained and the food ration cut thinner. They look at maps and understand that the coastline cannot be sealed. They look at casualty estimates and realize the army is preparing to trade the population for time. And in private, the words come out more clearly than they ever did in public. They speak about America as an enemy of scale. Not just strength, scale. A nation whose industrial output and manpower are too large to match in any conventional sense. They say that even successful attacks have failed to produce lasting strategic effect. Because the Americans do not stay wounded, they heal with steel, they heal with shipyards, they heal with new squadrons arriving fully trained and fully supplied. They speak about logistics as the silent executioner. They admit that the Empire's sea lanes have been cut, and with them the ability to move fuel, food, and ammunition. They admit that without oil, the fleet is a fleet in name only. They admit that the army can still fight on land, but without supplies, fighting becomes starving with rifles. When the discussion turns to negotiations, the room chills. Some leaders want to seek a way out. Others fear that seeking a way out is treason. They talk about preserving the kokutai, the national polity, as if the structure of the state is a fragile object that might survive even if everything else burns. By July 1945, the language of reality presses harder. American bombers roam with increasing freedom. Mines and submarines choke shipping. Factories are bombed. Rail yards are hit. Cities are ash. The production gap that was once a warning on paper is now visible in the sky every night. Then August arrives, and the war's final blows land with a force that feels beyond the scale of everything before. August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. A single bomb. A flash. A rising column. Reports are confused at first, then terrifyingly consistent. A city erased. Communications dead. Medical system overwhelmed. Survivors burned and blinded. Leaders struggle to understand what has happened, because the mechanism is new, but the meaning is immediate. America has reached a level of destructive power that makes Japan's remaining options collapse inward. August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki. Another blow. Another city. Another confirmation that the enemy's capacity is not diminishing, but escalating. And as if to remove any lingering illusion that time might save them, the Soviet Union enters the war against Japan, and Manchuria becomes a front that breaks open. The Empire's strategic position, already crumbling, now dissolves. In the imperial councils, the final arguments are not about whether Japan can win. That question has been dead for months, maybe years. The arguments are about what surrender means and whether the nation can survive it. Some leaders still speak of a last battle on the beaches. They speak of inflicting casualties. They speak of honor. But another voice, quiet and exhausted, answers with the simplest truth the war has taught them. Casualties will not stop America. Casualties will not empty American factories. Casualties will not sink American shipyards. The enemy's power is not a single fist. It is an endless line of fists. When Emperor Hirohito's decision is finally made, it is presented as an act to save the nation from annihilation. In those final meetings, the leaders who once tried to deny the arithmetic now accept it. The gap in production, logistics, and manpower has widened beyond recovery. The Empire has fought against a tide that rose higher every month, and now the tide has reached the palace steps, in the streets of Tokyo, among ruins and scorched beams. Civilians listen for the voice on the radio. Some weep, some sit in silence. Some stare at the ground as if looking for the old world beneath the ash. And in the quiet after the broadcast, when the words have been spoken and the war is finally ending, the realization that haunted the leadership from the beginning settles into its final shape. They did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they chose a war against an opponent whose power was measured not in battles alone, but in the ability to replace every loss, expand every effort, and turn time itself into a weapon.